WTO ministerial conference. Welcoming back to StratNews Global, Ambassador Dasgupta. Ambassador, good to see you, sir.
Likewise. Thank you for having me on the show.
Pleasure is all ours. After all, we are going to look into your mind and read your mind and all the experience you have, sir. But before I get into, looking at fleshing out what's really happened, could you explain to us how decisions are made in the WTO? I mean, I know they are by consensus, which means that anyone can veto them. There seems to be a lot of opaqueness in the system in these closed door negotiations, green room discussions, which when agreement is finally made are binding, right?
Yes, that's right.
So if you could just give us an idea of how these negotiations go on.
The negotiations are initiated by one group, which is known as the demandeur group. So they would table a written proposal, and then there would be discussions on that, and there could be counter proposals from others also, or supplementary proposals. So if there are other country groups which are strongly opposed to certain parts of a proposal, they would table a contrary proposal or an alternative proposal. Then discussions would go on in the negotiating group for each of the texts. For instance, for fisheries subsidies, there is the negotiating group on rules. For agriculture, the Committee on Agriculture would be the place where the negotiations would take place. So after every, let's say, 2 weeks or so, if there have been many meetings during that 2-week period, there would be many differences which would be ironed out, and new language which could be acceptable to both sides. Let's say there are only two sides on a particular issue. So then the text would be cleaned up, as you say it in Geneva. And the areas where there are strong differences, they would be put in square brackets. So one consolidated text would emerge within a few weeks, which would normally put 2 or 3 proposals together, and there would be one long text with many alternatives given in it. And as we go along the negotiating path, there would be more cleanups and fewer square brackets. Just to give us a flavor of what we went through, the trade facilitation agreement, when we had many proposals tabled and we started the negotiations in all seriousness in about 2011, there were 2,200 square brackets. And ultimately, when we went into Bali in 2013 December, there were only about 15 or so square brackets. Many of them were just placeholders which had been put in to extract something from the other side. So this is how negotiations go on. And if there aren't unbridgeable gaps, that depends on the chairman of the Trade Negotiations Committee. In the Doha round, the Trade Negotiations Committee was formed with the DG as the chairperson. So if the DG feels that this is something which can be pushed, and there would be some kind of an agreement which would emerge out of it before a ministerial, then other areas of negotiation which are not very promising would get dropped along the way. They would remain suspended, and all efforts would be made to harvest the agreements in a few areas. So in this ministerial, we had fisheries subsidies, which was almost a ready text with very few square brackets. Then we had the TRIPS waiver proposal, and then we had 2 or 3 shorter proposals which are not of great significance on the World Food Program and the WTO's response to the COVID pandemic. So these were some of the texts which were readied, let's say, a few weeks before the ministerial, but they had some differences still getting reflected through square brackets. When the ministers gather for the ministerial meeting, then, and a few days before that, the DG holds important meetings of a few important countries which have, let's say, very strong reservations and which could potentially block a final agreement. So these meetings will not be of the whole membership of 164, but they would be in varying configurations. Sometimes there would be just four ambassadors present, or maybe 10 or 20. And if there are major issues concerning the developing countries, groupings like the African, Caribbean, Pacific Coalition of Countries, the ACP, or the African Union, if it's an Africa specific issue, or the LDC group, they are all groups which are recognized in the WTO, or there could be a small island developing states group. So these would also be, conveners of these groups would also be called to the green room. Why is it called a green room? Is because many years ago, the color in the wall was green, light green in shade. But since then, it has been repainted several times, so it is no longer the green room, but the name continues. So, what the DG would try to do is to forge a consensus, to bridge over the differences, to suggest alternative language which could
Sure.
satisfy both sides. And that is where this expression comes in of constructive ambiguity. Sometimes the language suggested by either side is not acceptable to the other side. So the DG would come up, or some other member would come up with a language of constructive ambiguity which could be interpreted in various ways. So this is what happens in the run up to the ministerial meeting. So it would probably start a few months before the ministerial. It would pick up pace, and during the ministerial, if there are still a few areas where differences persist, then the ministers would be invited to join in the green room. A few ministers, it is seldom more than 10 or 15 ministers, because after that it becomes quite chaotic to get the
Mhm.
views of the members and to move forward to strike a consensus. So that is how the things are approached. And these negotiations go on. Normally, most of the square brackets should have been dropped well before the ministerial if there is a broad consensus emerging. But in this ministerial, there were certain areas which where differences persisted till the very end. So the ministerial had to be extended by one day, from the 16th to the 17th. And the 16th night, I think people worked feverishly to strike a consensus on some of the agreements. Now, there is one last point I wanted to mention in this context, that normally a few areas are being negotiated simultaneously. So there is a kind of balance which each country perceives, that if I concede some ground in one area, I should get what I want in some other area to a certain extent. So if things don't work out in all the areas simultaneously, the
Mm.
more important, the powerful countries, especially from the West, they feel that they can block consensus. So that is why there is an asymmetry of power in the WTO, because the developed countries do have more of a say. And in this context, it would also be important to mention that many of the smaller countries are facing balance of payments problems, because their exports are far less than their imports, and they constantly have to go to institutions like the IMF or the World Bank for getting out of one financial crisis or financial difficulty or the other. So and you know who controls these international
Yeah.
financial organizations. So these could be used to leverage the negotiating stance of the poorer countries, the weaker countries at the WTO. And
Sure.
that is what actually happened. So, though a decision is to be taken by consensus and every country theoretically has a veto, very seldom can they be in a position to
Mm.
exercise that veto if they are small, poor countries, especially LDCs.
There are other pressures that come in there. Just getting into what's happened in Geneva, Ambassador. Now, if I take agriculture, now in the current geopolitical context, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen what's happening with world food prices. Explain to us simply what is this agreement, especially in the context of India's key demand, which was to allow the export of food from subsidized public stockholding.
Uh, well, this does not even figure in the final outcome document. This was a demand which India had been raising along with members of the G33 coalition, which is headed by Indonesia and has about 47 developing countries, which have a defensive interest in agriculture, which means that they have a problem if imports come in larger quantities, and they want to provide livelihoods to their farmers as a primary concern. India, Indonesia, Kenya, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Zambia, these are some of the examples of the members of the G33 coalition. Now, in the WTO, what was being discussed for harvesting was primarily were primarily two issues. One, that there should be some language which should say that export restrictions of any kind or disruptions in the supply chain in the food market should not take place, because that would add to the misery of the poorer countries and lead to rising prices, especially in the backdrop of uh, rising global inflation and rising oil prices. So this was one part of the uh, you know declaration which the DG had in mind. The second part was about allowing the World Food Program to buy food from any country across the world and not be, uh, you know, uh, inhibited or prevented from buying food and exporting it to a poor country where there was a crisis in terms of food due to an export restriction placed by the country where the food was being procured. And India came into the picture because we have, in around 13th of May, we have imposed a restriction on
Yeah.
wheat
Wheat.
exports. We have also have put certain restrictions on sugar exports. Sugar is not all that important for from food purposes, especially to prevent let's say malnourishment or uh, uh, a crisis situation. So wheat is extremely important because the global market for wheat is about 185 million tons, and Russia and Ukraine, the two of them together, supply about 30% of wheat in the global market, which is about 55 million tons out of 185. So, a large number of countries, especially from Africa, which are not self sufficient in terms of cereals, they buy wheat from the market. So, with the Ukrainian supply coming down to a very thin trickle, they are exporting by road and rail to Eastern Europe, but their gauge, for instance, of rail does not match with that of their immediate neighbors, and so there is a problem. And road transport is also a problem from Ukraine. Their
Sure.
main port from which wheat used to go out was Odessa, and Odessa, as of March, the
Blocked.
Russians claimed that in the sea surrounding Odessa, they had laid mines, the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians said nothing of that sort was there. But the short point was shipments of wheat from Ukraine could not leave Odessa since about the 24th of February. I think the war started around the 22nd of February. So that is something which hindered the availability of wheat. The Russians could not also export wheat because they have said that because of the sanctions, the carriers of wheat, which could be foreign shipping lines, and the insurance which each shipment would need to have, those were covered by the sanctions. So, though the other side has clarified that the sanctions don't apply to food items, but this is a claim which the Russians have made. So, the Russian exports of wheat have also come down almost to very, very low levels. So, this has led to the crisis. What India wanted to ensure was that it had never stood in the way of the World Food Programme's procurement of food from India, whether it was rice or wheat or maize. But should there be an acute scarcity of any product which could lead to a domestic food security challenge, the country should have the means to prohibit exports. So ultimately, what emerged was there are two clauses in the particular document which says that no export restrictions should be placed for procurement and export of wheat from a country by the World Food Programme. And the second part says that the rights under the WTO agreements can be exercised by a country to address domestic food security challenges. So both
Sure.
things have been said, and India's position in that sense has been secured.
So
So these
how
are
are
the only two.
how are disputes resolved, Ambassador? I mean, here the government says that the interests of India's farmers have been completely taken into on board, but can they be systematically chipped away through legal disputes?
Well, the most important thing which is there at the moment under discussion in a way in the WTO is about, and this could figure in future. It is about reduction in the domestic subsidies and also providing market access, greater market access for imports. Now, India's program of procurement of food grains under the minimum support price and building up a public stock has come into question at the WTO. This has been the challenge has been raised not in a formal dispute, but
Yeah.
countries which were mainly exporters of agricultural products, mainly the Cairns group of countries, had been raising this issue. So this came to a head in the ministerial in Bali in 2013, and India and the G33 group said that this public stockholding program was meant to alleviate the suffering of the poor people who did not have adequate food. So government stocks were built up to provide food to them at subsidized prices. So this, a permanent solution to this problem could not be worked out, but a peace clause was provided for programs and crops which were already there being exercised by countries in 2013. And this was made immune to challenge in the WTO legal system. But this was it was predicated that it would be subject to the final solution or a permanent solution being arrived at. Now, one of the clauses which was added or provisos which was added to the peace clause was that exports from the public stocks would not be allowed because the public stocks were meant to feed the domestic, poor and the indigent, and two, for price stability reasons. So it was not to be released in the international market, which could disturb or distort international trade. So this was the argument given by the other side, and India and the G33 had to accept it because there were compulsions to get an agreement in Bali. The
Mm.
other thing which was inserted was that no new crops or programs would be added by any country. If they added any new crops or programs after 2013, these would not enjoy the benefits of the peace clause. So India in this ministerial had sought two things basically. One, a very quick resolution of this problem of the permanent solution which had been dragging its feet since 2013. And the permanent solution which India wanted would not have very strict conditionalities. It should be flexible so as to allow developing countries to exercise their discretion in managing their own affairs without recourse to huge imports or running up large bills and getting into BOP problems.
Yeah.
The two conditionalities specifically raised by India and other members were about exports being allowed from the public stocks, especially government to government transactions. As you know, many countries in Africa, Egypt, for instance, Morocco, and many other sub Saharan African countries, have sought wheat from India on the government to government route. So they are saying that you don't release it in the international market. It is a government to government transaction. This should be exempted. So India had raised this issue. Many other developing countries of the G33 coalition had said that you also allow us to have new crops and schemes covered under this program, even if they were introduced after 2013. India was not a major demander for this because 23 crops in India are covered under the MSP scheme from before 2013. So we have no problems on that score.
Mm.
So this was only a demand which India had made, and this was not conceded. This does not even figure in the final ministerial declaration. There is no statement which even says that the members should strive to have an early negotiated
Permanent
permanent solution
solutions.
worked out. So that is where we stand. So as the experts say, we are in the same position as we were before the ministerial, or let's say from about November 2014 onwards, when a clarificatory General Council decision was taken, which was confirmed in the Nairobi ministerial of 2015. So that is where we stand even now.
Let's get to fisheries, ambassador. And again, if you could explain it for us simply, because when I did my research, subsidies that India gives its fishermen are what, $15. When you look at the Scandinavian countries or even the Dutch, it goes from 35,000 to $70,000. So, what is the issue, and how did India emerge from these consultations and agreement?
Fisheries subsidies, interestingly, was given a mandate to be negotiated in 2001. So this is the second Doha round issue to be negotiated after the trade facilitation agreement. Now, in fisheries subsidies, there are three kinds of fishing or provisions which had been proposed. One was to put a complete ban on subsidies which went to fishing vessels or entities which were indulging in illegal, unreported, or unregulated fishing. For fishing in the territorial waters as well as the exclusive economic zone of a country which stretches to 200 nautical miles, each country issues licenses. It can issue licenses to its own fishermen. It can also issue licenses to foreign entities if it doesn't have adequate fishing capacity. And it makes some amount of revenue, especially which is important for the West African countries and for some of the small island countries in the Caribbean. So there was no quarrel about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. This has been going on in the FAO also for a long time. Why it was inserted in the WTO as a negotiating mandate was because the FAO is not competent enough to find out just how subsidies are flowing from the government to various entities, and it did not have the teeth to enforce a decision. The WTO, because of the dispute settlement system, has the teeth to enforce a decision. So that is why it came into the WTO. Now, IUU, there is no problem from India's side or from the side of any country. The only issue was a phase in period, because there are certain notification requirements which have to be met. How have you conducted this monitoring of the catch which comes in and lands at your fishing stations, for instance, to find out whether it is unregulated or illegal or unreported. So India wanted a phase-in period. 2 years has been provided. So India is happy with that, because we have also been, over the past 7-8 years, we have also been gearing up our own machinery, which is actually run by the state governments, concerned state governments in the coastal areas, stretching from Gujarat on one side to West Bengal on the other. So we are confident that in 2 years' time we will be able to meet all the requirements of notification. The second point was that no subsidies should be given by any country for overfished stocks.
Yeah.
So this takes place, by various fishing entities, especially in the high seas and also in the exclusive economic zone, where it is very difficult for smaller nations to monitor very carefully what is happening actually to the stock of fish. So, if either the coastal states or the regional fisheries management organization, in which each of the coastal states is a member, finds out that some stock is actually overfished, then there should be restrictions. And one of the restrictions is no subsidies for fishing for overfished stocks. So there was no problem with that also. India agreed, and a 2 year phase in period was allowed. The third issue, which is the most contentious and India had opposed it, was about capacity building, which the proponents have projected as overcapacity and overfishing. Because their argument, the implied argument is that the world already has an excess capacity in terms of the fish availability in the oceans. Globally, it is more than the required capacity. So, any new addition to the capacity would only aggravate the situation and lead to overfishing. Now, if you look at the developed countries, as starting with the European Union, Canada, the US, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and also the emerging countries like Korea, China, Taiwan, you will find that they have very consistently given heavy amounts of subsidies for decades. And that is how they have built up their fishing infrastructure. Now, they are already sitting pretty. If you put together their capacities, they have an overcapacity. So, India, which has just embarked on this uh, endeavor to build up its fishing infrastructure, India will conform to not overfishing, not indulging in IUU fishing, but it needs to build up its infrastructure to exploit the fish available within its exclusive economic zone, let's say. And for that, it needs to build up the fishing infrastructure. So that was sought to be prevented by giving a minimal kind of phase in period of 2 years or something, which would have meant, if India had accepted that, the doors would have been shut forever on India's modernization, because without government subsidization, the capital required to build fishing infrastructure is so high that if you use that, you will first be uncompetitive in the face of the heavily subsidized fishing infrastructure provided to other countries, developed countries mainly, and China.
Yeah.
Two, the fish that you sell, even if you sell it in the domestic market, would be so highly priced that nobody would be able to buy it. So, government subsidization for fishing infrastructure is extremely important. So, India asked for a phase in period of 25 years. That was not given. So, this is one area which was deferred, and it was mentioned in the preface of the agreement itself that without this, there would not be a comprehensive agreement. So this would be negotiated further and put in place. So of course, the Africans had certain other considerations. They wanted a clause to be inserted saying that there was something earlier in the earlier draft which said that if a country contributed less than 0.7% or 0.8% of the world's fish in the global market, then it would not be subject to these restrictions. So the Africans wanted changes in that, but anyhow, this has been deferred for a future date, and the negotiations will have to take place on this. India will have to negotiate hard. There is another clause in the agreement which says that if within 4 years this the full package is not worked out, that is a
Then it
comprehensive agreement
lapses.
including this is not worked out, then it will lapse, provided there is no decision of the General Council, which means, and the ministerial meeting is a special meeting of the General Council of the WTO. So, which means that if the ministers agree by consensus to extend it, it will get extended.
Right. Quick response, Ambassador, if you could give one of our viewers. Now, this refers to, I think, the moratorium that the developed countries have got for digital services, customs duties not being, put on them. The question is from Arvind25 says, can you please ask Ambassador what his views are on the levying of customs duties on cross-border digital streaming services like Netflix? Why do these companies get a free run?
India was opposed to giving an extension of the moratorium. It has been going on since 1998. And over a period of time, uh, with the development of digital technology, it has changed shape, and it has become much more uh, pervasive. Initially, it was about books, for instance, electronic books, music,
Yeah.
films, but now it has gone much beyond that, and there are studies conducted by UNCTAD, for instance, which show that the developing countries are losing. They are the main losers, incidentally, not the developed countries, of customs revenue. And the customs revenue has been calculated to be of the order of some 48-50 billion dollars per annum by way of not charging customs duties. The least developed countries also are losing about $8 billion per annum collectively on by not charging. So India was opposed to giving this extension to the moratorium, but the developed countries and China, they were uh, much more persuasive, let's say, and so a final decision emerged to give it till 2013 December, or if a ministerial was not held before that, which is unlikely to take place, to finally phase it out by December 2024. But again, it would be subject to the next ministerial, where again it would come up, and the other side, the demandeurs, were actually seeking earlier a permanent moratorium. And India was opposed to a permanent moratorium. India was also opposed to even a extension of the moratorium, but it couldn't have its way on this.
Talking about having its way, Ambassador, how do you see China in the WTO since it joined, was allowed to join? Has it benefited the most? I mean, on one hand, it still uses any kind of justification for gaining from being a developing country, yet it is so highly advanced in others. How do you see China in the WTO, Ambassador?
Uh, I think the Chinese were alive to the huge potential and possibilities of gaining from international trade from the days of Deng Xiaoping, 1979-80 onwards. So they very assiduously built up their infrastructure for manufacturing various kinds of products. For services, of course, they are not all that competent now, even now, in many areas. So they have been at it, and that is why from the early 90s onwards, they wanted to become members again of the WTO. Earlier in the GATT days, they had been members, but they had walked out.
Yeah.
So in 2001 at Doha, they were made permanent members of the WTO. Now, what has happened is because of two, three reasons. One, the Chinese wage rate was far lower than that of the West in the early 2000s, let's say. Even now, it is lower than that of the West. Two, they gave a very attractive package to the West to come and invest in their manufacturing industry. So, various kinds of sectors developed in China, all along the coastal region, for instance, and they contributed in a way to industrial development of China, and a lot of technology was transferred. Part of it was taken in an unauthorized manner. That is also part of the international research studies which have taken a note of this. So, as a consequence, the Chinese have built the largest manufacturing infrastructure anywhere in the world. The other point is that most of these companies or firms, they may be private companies on paper, but they are actually controlled by the uh, Chinese Communist Party in one way or the other. In many of them, you will find people of the People's Liberation Army, PLA, being in very vital positions. So decisions which are taken by these companies are often taken in tandem. They are controlled by the government, and you can say that they are, in a sense, state owned enterprises, SOEs, in a sense. Though on paper they may be, many of them may not fall within that definition. The last point I wanted to mention is that China, because of its growing exports and incomes, was able to hugely subsidize its companies, especially those with an export orientation, whether they were construction companies, whether they were producing goods and exporting them to various parts of the world. So they were able to hugely subsidize them, and many of these subsidies are non-transparent subsidies. If India, for instance, provides a subsidy at the state level or the central level, it goes up on the website and it is very clearly delineated, and procedures are mentioned, who is eligible, who is not eligible. In China, it has become a huge problem. The US decided to take China to the WTO dispute settlement process, and it uh, compiled a list of subsidies which the Chinese were given. It ran to hundreds of pages, and still it was not the final thing. The problem with China is that it has a federal government, it has provincial governments, it has city governments, and the way the subsidies have changed shape and character is that once they are challenged in the WTO, or they are raised in bilateral talks, they disappear from the federal list, and they find their place in the provincial list or in the city list. And in the city list, it's next to impossible to find out what kind of subsidies are being given. There are people who have been to China and studied it at length and say that city governments sometimes give subsidies on a unit to unit basis. So the unit next to you may get a higher amount of subsidy, you may not even know about it. There are no documents which are kept about it. So it is only one document kept with the city government and one with the beneficiary. No other copy of that is available. So that is the problem with China.
The opaqueness. But it was interesting to see how the US and China were working together at the WTO, despite the competition and even the combative nature of trade policies. But one last question, Ambassador, in terms of India's policies, we've seen a spate of free trade agreements, whether it was with Australia, UAE, we're talking to Israel, the EU now, straight after Geneva, UK, Canada. How does a bilateral FTA sit within WTO trade rules?
There are many areas in which it is possible to give a bilateral concession. You are not, for instance, if you are dealing with the UK, about 75% roughly of its GDP comes from services. Manufacturing is about 17% or 18%, and agriculture is very little. So you are, not all that much threatened, let's say, or there are complementarities in the economies of the UK and India, where we can give concessions to the UK for various kinds of manufactured products without being threatened by a huge surge of imports. Because the kind of things which we produce and export, let's say gems and jewelry, garments, leather goods, the UK
Textiles.
doesn't do that. So there are complementarities. The UK, for instance, produces a lot of sophisticated electronic products, high tech products. In those items, we can give access to the UK. So there are complementarities. In services also, the UK wants to have agreements, mutual recognition agreements for professional services like
Hmm.
legal services, accountancy,
Doctors.
education services, etc. So there, we also don't have too much of a problem, but it is subject to negotiations because we'll have to look at the future to see whether we will get inundated and we will have a very adverse kind of effect in India if we allow their law firms, for instance, to come in large numbers and take away all the business generated by large multinational corporations, not only of British origin but from anywhere else in the world. So that is the kind of thing which we'll have to assess. But overall, I think if there is one developed country and one developing country on the other side of the table, it studies have shown that it produces the best results. FTAs with developing countries, especially if they have a similar kind
Similar
of
basket of goods and
an
services.
economy, is sometimes difficult and may not provide adequate benefits to either side.
Ambassador Dasgupta, absolutely appreciate your time and experience and expertise in trying to simplify a very complex issue for all of us here at StratNews Global and all our viewers who also joined us.
Pleasure.
And some of our well-wishers have asked for a UPI payment ID to contribute and support us. There's a link in the YouTube descriptor and just putting up the UPI ID as well. And you can also, as soon as the stream ends, click and buy a YouTube super thanks. That's the heart icon, like right next to the thumbs up that you give this video if you choose to, where you can directly support StratNews Global with about 70%, I think, of your chosen amount. YouTube keeps the rest. And just to thank one of our viewers who has contributed, Gaurav, with the Canadian dollars 10, saying that StratNews is doing a great job. Thanks for the compliment, Gaurav. We'll continue to hopefully bring you more such conversations. Do keep the engagement with us going. This is the Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.